Well, can everyone hear me who wants to? It's an important distinction. So, Edward, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's such an honor to be back here in Town Hall. I was here a few years ago, and I have to say, you know, Seattle's really fortunate to have a venue like this. This is just, it's incredible, and I'm grateful to be here. Like Edward said, I'm here to sort of discuss a book I just published, this Impulse Society thing. But before I do, I wanted to sort of open with some comments about publishing generally, which, as you know, is going through a lot of changes. And the business of publishing is sort of being remade every 30 seconds or so. And the act of publishing it's becoming fucking bizarre. I'll just tell you, if you publish a book, you're expected to support it by writing op-eds and articles. And because these appear in online places, you're subjected to the online world, which means that eventually, sooner or later, you're going to confront who? The troll, right? And you're all familiar with the troll reading comment sections, but I have to tell you, when you're reading it about yourself or something you've done, it is incredible. And I'd sort of been out of this space for a while, so it's like a slap in the face. And of course, I'm reading the comments, and so I'm reading them. It's just like getting hit, and they're so nasty. But my reaction is instead of getting mad, I think, oh, dude, you don't understand. You misunderstood what I said. I just need to clear this up for you. Send me your number and we can hang out. And my editor is saying, don't read the comments, you idiot. These are not people. You don't need to think of them as people, because by the time they're trolling, they've stopped being people. And I'm thinking, he's being extreme and protective, the she-bear, but there's truth in that, right? I mean, it to some degree, because the circumstances of trolling are really dehumanizing. If you think about the technology that we've sort of created allows them to sort of disengage from the normal social rules that sort of inhibit that kind of nastiness. So I mean, just think about it, they're sitting in near total social isolation, their parents' basement, right? And they've got this technology that sort of allows them to respond instantly to any impulse they have. If they want to express the nastiest thing they can, and they can do it free of any consequences, right? They're doing it in total anonymity, and I think this is more important, they're doing it without having to confront the way that comment zings somebody. They don't have to watch me burst into tears, all right? So they're not required to endure the social pressures that would normally inhibit that kind of nastiness. And it makes you realize that that's what happens when you give people capability to sort of step away from these social constraints. They're sort of free to pursue immediate self-interest. And in many cases they do. They give into that temptation. Now I'm talking about trolling, but it does raise the question, what if you were to run a whole society that way? I mean, suppose, just hypothetically, that you were to create a system whose main sort of function was to create capability for individuals, and a lot of that capability was going to be used to allow them to disengage from the social system and pursue self-interest, as narrowly and immediately as possible. I mean, what would a society like that look like? Well, all right, so as you may have surmised from the title of my book, I happen to think that we know what that society looks like. We're sort of in it, or we're approaching it. Because, we're not all trolling, at least I hope. I hope that this group isn't totally devoted to that activity. But we do live in we do occupy a socioeconomic system whose primary function is providing individuals with capability, and a lot of that capability ends up being used to disengage from restraints on behavior, including many social restraints. And one of the results is that we are more and more focused on the pursuit of immediate, narrow self-interest. And I have to tell you, as a sort of a model for running a society, it doesn't work. And we have the evidence all around us. I mean, someone just said Wall Street. I mean, the financial meltdown, if you think about it, is really an example of this activity sort of times 300 million. It's what happens when an entire society uses its capabilities to sort of forget about tomorrow. And you can go down the list. The political paralysis that the country is sort of still mired in is an example of what happens when a political culture is so accustomed to getting what it wants that it forgets how to compromise. And you can go down the list. And it doesn't work. I mean, it simply doesn't work. On a short-term basis, we manage to sort of produce many of the things we think we need. but long-term we're failing. And the question really that we should be asking is, how do we recover the capacity to think more deliberatively on a longer time scale and beyond the self? Because we used to do that with some regularity. I mean, we were never, it's never the age of perfect, but we used to do that with some regularity and with some familiarity with the process. How do we get back to that? Is it possible to get back? And if it is, what would be the best pathway? And that's really what I want to talk about tonight, and what I want to sort of engage in a conversation with you all about. Now, I first sort of got interested in this about 6 years ago. I was doing this book about the food business, and initially my sort of hope was I wanted to understand the economics of the food industrial complex, which sounded really engaging at the time. And but the longer I got into it, I realized that what was really interesting was the way that the food system, the industry, the culture, what it had really done is it had sort of dissolved the social relations around food. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'll tell you. What I meant was that food is an intensely social subject, is a social thing. It happens as a result of intense social interactions. And for most of human history, you could not be disengaged from the social system and not starve. So what the food industry did was it came along and sort of helped us overcome that. And it did this by making food a heck of a lot cheaper and much more convenient and much safer and in many ways much tastier and more sort of personalized and customized to our own desires. And this is great. And really what's happening here is it's allowing us to sort of overcome a lot of these social impediments to total food freedom, to sort of caloric self-expression, if you will. Because, if you think about it, up until recently, all your food moves, all your food decisions were really made in an intense social context. So, food preparation is a complex process, so you relied on expertise, which was typically one person in the household, that's your mom, which means you have to sort of eat when she tells you you can eat, and eat what she gives you to eat. And you typically have to sit through 1, maybe 2, maybe even 3 family meals a day, and that means endure the sort of social and socializing process that goes along with that. And it's a heck of a lot of work just to get fed. And you could see that purely as an impediment, as sort of a massive inefficiency to your caloric self-expression. And so the food industry comes along and sort of grants us this incredible, it liberates us. All at once, you didn't require any of those social relations, or at least not nearly as many. You could eat when you wanted, what you wanted, as often as you wanted. You could avoid the sort of the withering look that people would give you if you had 2 desserts or 3, or if you decided to eat at 3 in the morning, and eat those 3 desserts at 3 in the morning. I mean, and so what you end up with is this level of food freedom, which, all kidding aside, is great. I mean, the good news is we had been granted a huge amount of power over our food choices. The bad news is that we've been granted a huge amount of power over our choices, so much so that we began to it turned into a sort of a free-for-all. And we got to the point where there were no real social restraints anymore. We were simply left to our own devices and to our own desires. We could sort of create a food culture, a food sort of experience that perfectly matched not the consciousness, but the id. And so what we end up with is, well, and I wanted to sort of show a picture here. So do I need to press a button, or will it magically come on? All right, so this is from one of my favorite important news sources, The Onion, right? And the headline here was that Arby's has this new offer for $2.99. You can leap behind the counter and grab up armloads of roast beef, as much as you can carry. And right, for another 50 cents, you can dip it into buckets of sauce, right? Now, to the degree that and we can gaze upon this for a few more seconds here. It is marvelous, and well, that's the good. Did they make it up? That's a good question. We can turn that off now. I think we've seen enough. To the degree that you find that humorous, it's because it's only like 2 or 3 angstroms from reality, right? I mean, most people. I drove by an Arby's today. I was actually looking to see if there was actually that offer, underway. I mean, the food system is essentially set up to allow a free-for-all, and it's not just fast food. It's much of the mainstream food system. And, we don't necessarily all leap over the counter, but it's coming. It feels as if it's coming, It feels as if it's just around the corner, because there's really fewer and fewer social restraints to food behavior. And the truth is, it's not just the food industry. it's sort of across the board. I mean, you're talking food, talking transportation, we're talking consumer credit, we're talking personal technology. I mean, more and more, the model there is that we're going to remove all restraints, all material restraints, and also all social restraints. And we'll leave the expression entirely up to you, and we'll hope for the best. And we'll sort of invoke Adam Smith, and we'll say that, well, look what happens if everyone's pursuing narrow self-interest. Everything is made better, and the fact that it isn't actually is a glitch. You know, it's a problem, and it probably has to do with government overregulation. So, and so I want to suggest that, you know, we're really, Arby's, that picture could sort of be the sort of the icon for the society that we're building. And I don't mean to imply that we're all leaping over the counter, sort of metaphorically, but I do want to suggest that that's becoming the model, and I want to suggest that it's not sustainable. And I also want to suggest that it isn't, you know, it's not everybody all the time, obviously. I mean, you all managed to get here without running over pedestrians or screaming out, I'm assuming, you know, yelling out the window. So obviously we're capable of being deliberative and long-term, but incrementally, things are changing. I mean, incrementally more of this capability is flowing into the marketplace, and incrementally our behaviors are changing. I mean, look at what's happening in the social media. I mean, we do things routinely today that 30 years ago would have been regarded as frankly obscene. You know, think about it. I mean, to do 30 years ago when I was in high school, what I do regularly today, I would have to get up early in the morning and take a bunch of Polaroids of my breakfast and myself and several different poses, and then somehow make numerous copies and go to school and walk around and hand them to people with a little, you know, like me. And what actually would have happened was every time I did that, I would get punched, because at least in my school, you simply would never, ever self-promote like that. I mean, who the hell are you, right? You're not special. As Jon Stewart said, you're not special. That's what his mom would have told him when he was a kid. We weren't special. And yet today we routinely do that and more. We post. We proclaim the most intimate or mundane or intimate mundane detail. And not only that, we sort of demand affirmation that it was a good thing, right? We want to be, we post, we change our portrait, right? So we get more likes, we harvest likes, you know? So the technology has sort of allowed us to sort of come up with this new form of evaluating ourselves and valuing ourselves, and it's based on the sort of the provocativeness of the thing we post. Well, geez, I wonder what's going to happen now. Do you think that we're going to start putting up more and more provocative posts? Do you think we're going to be getting more extreme in the sorts of behavior that we promote? I mean, you know, yes, it turns out that we do. I mean, what a surprise. So that we have people killing themselves, literally, so they can get the most awesome selfie, you know? And everything about experience now is, I can't wait to post this. I mean, think about it. And I have to say, you know, even someone as sensible as I am still hurt when I post a picture of something cute, a cat video, and no one likes it. I spend the whole day kind of pouting, like, well, what's wrong, you know? And how come he got like 400 likes for that? I mean, so we've sort of reestablished you know, this way of sort of valuing ourselves, and it has changed our behavior. I mean, now you get that lady down after the San Francisco earthquake last week, and she's crossed the safety barrier so she can stand right underneath this wrecked cornice, right, to get a selfie, because it's going to be awesome. And the only reason she's not dead is because there wasn't an aftershock, and she just doesn't have the capacity to sort of see past the idiocy of herself to see how ridiculous that is. And it really points up that the risk of a society that is so shaped by the self, the risk isn't just, you know, the economy crashes, or that we run the environment into the ground, or that we stop being able to plan for the future. The risk is that we get so focused on self-gratification, and by extension, the self, that we can't see past it. That the self sort of grows like a big moon, right, and just blocks everything. And then we can't see around it, because we have finite attention spans, right? It's a limited resource, and if you're spending more and more of your time focusing on self-gratification, and by extension the self, because you have the capability to do that, because it's flowing into the marketplace, it stands to reason you'll have less attention to devote to other things. And folks, I got to tell you, this is not the time to not be focusing on other things. We have substantial challenges that we need to be focusing that limited bandwidth on. And the more that we focus, because we're allowed to, on frankly trivial things, it isn't helping us. So again, the question is, how do we step back from this? And how do we step back from this in a way that doesn't feel like it's, you know, something oppressive from above? Because really, when you're talking about individual capability, even capability to do terribly stupid things, when you're talking about sort of fixing that problem, you immediately run into the other problem, which is that we're talking about individual power, right? We're talking about the limits to individual power, and that's a pretty dicey topic to raise in this society. I mean, Americans in particular are pretty concerned about the optimization, the maximization of individual power and the maintenance of that individual power. And we don't take too kindly to reductions in that. And we haven't historically. I mean, it's a part of our character. And on top of that, maximizing individual capability is what we've sort of been aiming for economically for the last, 10,000 years. I mean, that's really been the goal, right? To give the individual more and more power to shape existence to his or her preferences. I mean, that's what we want, to make more, to have more of the things we want and less of the things we don't. I mean, what's wrong with that? And if you sort of ask it from that angle, it becomes really difficult to think about altering this equation that we've set up. So my approach has been not to do that, to avoid being shot or have things thrown at me, and instead to focus on the power itself, the nature of the power that we're sort of pouring into our space. Because when you do that, you start recognizing that the power is intensely problematic. It's deeply flawed. It has all sorts of weaknesses. And the closer you look at it, the more you realize that it's actually in many cases disempowering. I mean, as one example, if you are getting more power to sort of disengage from social structures and therefore have the capacity to pursue self-interest, you're at the same time losing the social associations that we know from research and just personal experience are incredibly empowering. That's where we get our sustainable power, from social relations. And yet if we're empowering ourselves to break away from those, we're undercutting our own power. That's a lot of power in the same sentence, but I think you take my point. And on a more fundamental level, this power that we're sort of collecting and focusing on the pursuit of immediate, narrow self-interest, this power, if you think about it, in most cases, it doesn't have anything to do with us. It's not really our power. In most cases, we didn't make it. It was produced often very far away by producers that really don't share any of our interests. They are simply producing a capability, be it a credit card, a car, a calorie, because that's the most efficient way to meet their revenue targets. And this is nothing new. Obviously, this is how the economy works, but in the context of this conundrum we face about this sort of abundance of individual capability, when you recognize this gap between the agendas of the power producers and the agenda of the power consumers, namely us, it really throws this paradox into relief, and it makes it, I think, easier for even hardcore self-gratifiers to consider the possibility that maybe they'd want to rethink how they use power and whether they use power. And so that's what I'm going to do. So I have in the book, for example, some examples of that sort of demonstrate the hollowness of this power. And my favorite is what I call the great horsepower race. Now this is what Detroit went through beginning in the late 1940s when actually Oldsmobile discovered that if you put a gigantic V8 engine in a mid-sized car, two things would happen. It would win races at NASCAR and it would sell like hotcakes. It sold like 500,000 units. It just blew the doors off of the competition, and all of a sudden there's this competition to a horsepower race, a horsepower arms race. So every year, companies they're pouring their engineering staff, and this is into sort of producing more horsepower, which is sort of ironic because up until that point, Detroit had been trying to make engines that were more fuel efficient. But forget that. We're going to produce horsepower, and every year it's more. We're going to do turbocharging, we're going to do supercharging, we're going to put 2 barrels, we're going to do 4 barrels. We need 6 barrels, 6-barrel carburetors. We're pretty much pouring the gasoline into the engine, and horsepower is going up, and people are snapping it up. Now, why? Why? Well, Detroit's very interested in this. It turns out, first of all, that the cars up until that point had been somewhat underpowered, and it was nice to have a little more horsepower to merge in traffic maybe, but past a point, it quickly became not a matter of need, but simply want. Why did we want that power? Well, this too Detroit was very interested in, and this is the beginning of sort of the psychologizing of marketing. So they're like putting teams of psychologists to sort of survey consumers, and what they're discovering is that we just like to go fast. I mean, there's a thrill of acceleration. It's why we like roller coasters. And on top of that, there's some psychological heavy lifting we're doing with this horsepower and with other power. It's not just the power we're getting from our cars, it's from our other tools. It's power to sort of compensate for our lack of power in other parts of our life. Now, this is what the psychologists are discovering, and they're all Freudian, so naturally they're going to say this, but we're compensating for sort of the disempowerment we feel in maybe our corporate work life, or the disempowerment we feel in this sort of mundane suburban middle class existence, or a marriage or a social set that isn't as exciting as we thought it would be. And horsepower is a great compensator. And so every year when more of this horsepower comes out, we use it. And this is actually not a good result if you think about it, because the way that you sort of express your purchase of more horsepower is you go faster. And if you look at what horsepower did over the from the late 40s to the early 60s, it triples. And top speed goes from about 85 miles an hour to 145 miles an hour. Now, we all weren't driving that fast, but we were driving faster. And it quickly became apparent that horsepower now exceeded the capacities of the car. The steering, the brakes, the suspension, the tires, the roads, and certainly the capacity of the drivers. We had far too much power for our own good, and we started wrecking. I mean, the number of fatal crashes is skyrocketing. It's almost following the power curve. And the carnage is just piling up. And you have to sort of think what's happening. We're getting this power that we didn't really need and didn't really know we wanted. And it's sort of the result because Detroit has these massive plants that it's invested in. And in order to make those investments deliver a good return, they have to generate volume. And in order to generate volume, they have to get us to buy cars more often than we need to. And power turns out to be a great way to do it. So we're buying this power and we're expressing it, and it's allowing us to sort of project our inner turmoil, if you will, onto our neighbors. So we can take our idiosyncrasies and our anxieties and our insecurities and sort of project them using this horsepower to often lethal effect. Now this is an important point. Think about where the decision to do that projecting is being made. It's not necessarily happening in the head of the driver. I mean, I'm not saying the driver is not responsible ultimately, but the power, the decision has a lot to do with the fact that the power is present in the marketplace. And the reason the power is present in the marketplace is because there's a business model that requires it. So what you've done is you've essentially taken the decision to do something as crazy as projecting your insecurities onto your neighbors, and you've sort of outsourced that. You've sort of spread that decision making, and you've systematized it, and you've essentially given it to the marketplace. And in exchange, you've sort of adopted the values of the marketplace, which is this: if there's a capability, you'll use it. I mean, if there's a capability that allows you to increase your return faster, you will use it. And you can see this pattern sort of emerging everywhere. It's not just in cars. It's in it's in many sectors. It's obviously in the food sector. It's in the consumer credit sector. Slowly but surely, we are moving our decision making into the marketplace, and we are adopting a shorter term sort of mindset that simply focuses on the return we can get and not on the consequences, and assumes that if the capability is there, it's okay. I mean, it's legal, right? So what's wrong with it? Now, this is happening through the Mad Men eras, essentially, and there is still a great deal of capacity in the social system and the political system to sort of put a lid on this. I mean, we still have a very strong regulatory state. We have a regulatory state that's quite willing to intervene in the economy, is not afraid at all of regulating heavily. We also have a social system that is that's still a mainstream culture that is still somewhat dubious about naked self-interest. And we have companies that are, for all their power, are fairly they're cowed by government. They can still be pushed around. But all this changes beginning in the 1970s. Two big things happen. I mean, the first is that computers show up, and they essentially allow companies to accelerate every business process that I've just been describing and deliver power to individuals much faster. But as importantly, at the same time, companies go through this sort of radicalization of a new ideology sort of descends. It's called the shareholder revolution. And for those of you who aren't intensely interested in the 70s economic history, I'm assuming, yeah, not, okay, so I'll just outline it briefly. Essentially what we have is the economy collapses, the post-war miracle dies, thanks to high oil prices and recession and a host of events, and everyone is hurting. It's the worst recession since the Great Depression. But the people complaining the most about it are the investors, because they've just seen their investments cut in half. The stock market's dropped half in value, and they're really pissed off, all right? And they say to corporate America, if you ever let share prices fall that far again, here's what we'll do. We will buy up the companies whose share prices have fallen, we will fire all your asses, and then we will tear those companies apart and sell them piece by piece. And that's what we'll do, all right? It's sort of the death penalty for losers. And corporate America got the message loud and clear. And from that point on, it's like, yes, well, I guess share price is the most important thing. And more specifically, since what drives share price is quarterly earnings and meeting those quarterly earning targets, that becomes the mantra. And to lock that in, to sort of embed that philosophy in the actions and thoughts and dreams of our management, what are we going to do? We're going to change the compensation system. How are we going to do it? We're going to switch. Instead of getting your money in salary and bonus, more and more is going to come in what form? Stocks and stock options. Yes. So at a stroke, we turn managers into investors, and we realign their loyalties. And their loyalties are now with the stock market. And economists are saying this is great because the stock market is efficient and it's really smart. It's got the collective intelligence of millions and millions of investors, and they are thinking about maximizing self-interest, but collectively, Adam Smith tells us, that will lead us to a better result than anything else. So get the hell out of the way, all right? The future is here, all right? And this is a radical departure from what had been going on during the post-war period. I mean, as much as we like to sort of, complain about corporations, they perform they're a huge piece of the economic infrastructure, right? I mean, and during the post-war period, they served as these stabilizers because corporations were, for all their problems and all the bad side, they also created a lot of public good. They were massive producers of capital. They were huge producers of innovation. They were the ones who made these massive investments in R&D. And they also made lots of investments in their employees. They were constantly upgrading the employees' skill levels so that the employees could compete and be more productive. And all in all, they were fairly long-term. They were making these long-term investments. And they weren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They were doing it because they felt that was the way that you had sustainable long-term profits. And they had a lot of encouragement from the government, and they had encouragement from labor unions who pretty much had a captive, we had a closed labor market, so labor was very powerful. But what you ended up with was a sort of a corporate model that was long-term and focused on the long term. And all of a sudden, it wasn't anymore. It was focused on the short term. It was focused on hitting near-term earnings. And this changes everything. So you see all of a sudden the behavior of the corporations just basically makes a 180-degree turn. So, where companies had been really reluctant to do layoffs because they were so disruptive, all of a sudden layoff becomes a standard tool for bumping up share price. I hate to say it, but one of the quickest ways to raise your earnings is to cut costs. And since labor is one of the biggest costs, sorry guys. And it is always the case that companies sometimes overhire, but layoffs and downsizing has become a routine way to tell the stock market, we're serious about maintaining share price. Not surprisingly, when those incentives move that way, you see all this kind of bizarre short-term behavior. So this is when we see the rise of all the accounting scandals. As companies just blatantly inflate their earnings. Oh, no one will look. Oh, they did. Okay, we'll restate them. We made a mistake. So the number of earnings restatements, it's a nice way of saying we lied, goes from a few a year to like dozens a month. So this is sort of where Enron shows up. And then these like really clever sort of gimmicks where companies are doing things to sort of just outright manipulation. So I'm sure you're familiar with the share buyback program. This is where you take your cash and you spend it buying back your own shares. And what that does is it pushes up the price of the remaining shares. And it sort of gives the impression of robust health, and it gets the investors off your back, but you haven't taken any business risk, right? You certainly haven't, invented a new product or hired anyone, but you have gotten the share price up, which is the goal. So you've gone to that short-term goal. And share buybacks have become this sort of standard tool. So right before the financial crash, companies were spending, on the 500 companies on the S&P 500 were spending 70% of their profits on share buybacks in sort of a desperate effort to keep share prices high. Instead of just letting the market correct, no, we want to make sure the bubble is higher when it finally collapses. And as a bonus, they had so depleted their cash reserves that when the bubble did burst, many of them needed what? Government bailouts, right? So it worked out perfectly. And of course, we haven't learned our lesson because share buybacks are just, they're going gangbusters today. I mean, last year we spent almost $600 billion. $600 billion on share buybacks. This as companies are right and left whacking, let's downsize this. And so you basically have these companies that used to be sort of stalwarts of this sort of technical industrial complex. And for all the downsides of that complex, there were a lot of upside, including a lot of innovation. So companies like IBM and Hewlett-Packard, the pillars of the digital age, and these companies are now just slashing everything in sight and totally demoralizing their workforces and not investing at all in employee training and then trying to cover over the mess with these massive share buybacks. So you can see, what's happening here is the entire economy it's sort of all adopting this same pattern. Corporations are behaving like consumers, which is sort of, it's a sad thing to say, but corporations are behaving like consumers and no one is really minding the store. And so the entire economy, you start seeing the way we invest, the sort of things we innovate, the technologies we prize, the expertise that we focus on when we go to college. It's all being focused around this sort of algorithm of short-term, narrow self-interest. So you look at where graduates go. You know what a STEM graduate is, a science, technology, education, and math. These are sort of essential personnel for an economy like ours. And you need those people to be running the machinery, right? And coming up with the innovation. Beginning in the 90s, they all started going where? To Wall Street, because you could make a lot more money. And now, where are they going? They're going to the sort of the personalization economy. The economy that's sort of built around using big data to sort of figure out what you want based on your credit card purchases and other activity that you might not want anyone to know about. And so you have this sort of bizarre thing where people who have this incredible expertise that could be used in some really, socially useful ways are using it in different ways. So an example I was just reading in the Wall Street Journal, there's this guy, I assume it's a guy, they sort of leave the gender out, who is he's designed these incredible algorithms that comb through medical records and find early warnings for breast cancer. And if you think about it, what a great use of technology, right? Here's the thing where you're taking big data and sort of you're pointing it in the right direction. That would be a great thing to have. But he got hired by Yelp. And now he uses that algorithm to sort of make these awesome consumer rating systems so you can go rate your plasma screen TV and your coffee maker. And I realize that's important, right? But you sort of see this sort of huge shift in sort of where we focus where our priorities are. I just have to check my smartphone here to see how much time. Okay, so you guys hold on a second. I've got a game I have to play here. So, and speaking of it, you look at the sort of things that now pass for innovation. Apple. Okay, so Apple. Here's a great one. They've committed to spend $150 billion on share buybacks. And meanwhile, what's their latest innovation? We'll find out next week because it's going to be super awesome, right? iPhone comes in 2 sizes. Wow. Well, last year it was a iPhone 5C that came in colors. Can you imagine? Wow. I'm just blown away. My world has changed, or what about, Amazon? I gotta be careful now, right? There go the buy buttons on my book, but I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. Wherever you are, they're everywhere. But Amazon, mixed bag. A lot of really profound and positive innovations. If you ask authors who were sort of excluded from the market because they didn't have an agent or they didn't have a publisher, they can now self-publish, and that's amazing. But also, Amazon does some other things that are incredibly disruptive and not necessarily in a positive way. Their new phone, the Fire. I'm sure, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the main sort of feature of the Fire is that it can quickly scan any item apparently in the known universe and then take you to a link where you can buy it on Amazon. So any song, they talk about the song or the artwork. It's like, I'm sure you could walk by a rock and scan it. Oh yeah, there it is. Okay, but really, what's it for? It's for showrooming, right? And that's where you go into a Target or a JCPenney and you go up and you scan something and then you buy it on Amazon. And it also comes with a year of Amazon Prime, which means that you can, while you're standing in the store, you can order it and have it delivered. It shows up free 2 days later. So this is great, but two things occur to me, and I hope occur to other people. So you've got this fire, and you walk into a store, and you sort of ask the dude, okay, so where's those big screen TVs? And he's like, oh, I'll take you there. You're like, you feel guilty, right? Because he's going to walk you over there, and you're going to kind of one-click him out of a job, right? So there's going to have to be this whole new social form that arises, how you look at a person when you're about to sort of destroy their livelihood. So it's and then on top of that, it's kind of like short term, if you think about it, because if we're all showrooming, and it's not just Amazon, I mean, everyone has one of these apps. If we're all showrooming, then pretty soon showrooms disappear, because who would operate a showroom if you're not actually buying anything there? And so you're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. So what are you going to do with the phone? You're going to sit there and take a selfie of yourself in front of the abandoned, Target store. I mean, talk about short-term innovation. And more that's this kind of thing we're proud of, or we're not proud of. But that's sort of what we point to as a sign that we're still there, we haven't given up. Our manufacturing coming back because, we're eating our young, And so, at this point, I'm supposed to now solve all these problems. But I have just a little bit more bad news. So in a more perfect world, this is the point when the political institutions would ride into the rescue. Right, and we've done that in the past. It's sort of roughly speaking, we have organized ourselves collectively to take on complicated and painful challenges. We have, depressions and world wars and civil rights, and we haven't done it elegantly all the time, and we haven't done it willingly necessarily all the time, or at least happily, but we've done it. It's getting harder and harder to sort of picture us sort of turning as a political sort of culture and confronting this. Because the political culture is now sort of captured by the same short-term mentality, and we could spend days, or I could spend days talking about it. You probably couldn't spend days listening, but I'll give you just two examples. One is that there's so much money now in politics that it operates as an arm of the financial markets. I mean, it uses the same terminology, the same models. I mean, they have to raise money constantly, so they think of their donors as investors. They think of that as capital that they're getting, and they seek the highest return. And the highest return is usually generated by extreme political behavior. You can pretty much guarantee a fast return by flaming your opponent. So we've got that going for us. And at the same time, we are using many of the technologies, the big data technologies that we perfected in the consumer space, and we're now using them to sort of figure out how people vote and how we can manipulate that, right? So that we now know how to micro-target. We can sort of figure out, well, I know what you voted for last time, and I know, based on your credit card purchases, what sort of message sort of trigger I'll need to send you to get you off the couch to vote. And it's usually sort of negative stuff. And you put those things together, and you no longer are puzzled by the fact that the system is totally paralyzed. I mean, paralysis turns out to be a pretty great gig if you're only into short-term gratification. So, believe it or not, in the midst of the government shutdown, you could actually see a way out of this entire mess. How, you ask? I'll tell you. It's actually, I shouldn't say in the midst, it was in the aftermath. Because after that, you could kind of hear the entire system go, well, I was about to say an expletive, but I mean, there was a sigh of sort of like, whoa, like, what are we doing? This is so screwed up. We have basically taken the most powerful yada yada nation in the world and ground it to a halt because of what exactly? And there was this sort of reprieve. And what was happening in that reprieve was a lot of politicians, certainly not all of them, but a lot of politicians were sort of stepping back from this machine they'd built, this machine that continued to pour capability into the space, whether it's the political space, the commercial space. And they stepped back from that, at least momentarily, and they sort of recovered an older set of rules. Now it happens that older set of rules was just as corrupt, but they were able to at least use it. It was more functional. And they were able to pass a few short-term spending bills and sort of get the wheels of government moving, however creakily. Now it was just temporary, and it was by no means perfect, but it was sort of a template for the rest of us to sort of consider, because what they'd done was they had created a temporary space between themselves and this system and its values. And as they had created that space, they were able to recover a different set of values. Now, their particular values weren't sustainable. It didn't last. We're right back at it. But the point is, that notion of space creation, that's where it's at. Being able to push back and to insist on a different, more humane set of values, and not be running along on the market's values, because we're not market units, it turns out. And what's interesting and encouraging is that you can see this sort of pushing back, this rebellion happening all over the place. It's happening as people are sort of just getting disgusted with the status quo. And they're pushing back. You can see it. It's the people who unplug, who decide their family's going to unplug from personal technology because they can see what it's doing to their kids. You can see it's the political junkie who says, forget the echo chamber. I'm not going to watch Fox and I'm not going to watch CNBC because they are poisoning my faith in democracy. It's people who are backing off from these systems and insisting on something new. Maybe in many cases they may not know what that new thing is, but they're trying it. And these efforts they're fragmented, they're solitary, they're often pursued out of panic and anxiety, but they're a beginning. And what we need to do is to find a way to give voice to those, and some sense of unity, and give them a sort of a sense of purpose and a direction. And also I'll close my little session here by telling you this story that I find really encouraging, and that is independent bookstores. 10 years ago, these were the next dinosaur. Remember? They couldn't withstand the chains, they couldn't withstand the Amazons and other online vendors. They didn't have a chance, and in fact, they were disappearing. And then 5 years ago, something happens, right? There's turnaround, and since then, they've been adding numbers every year. Now, what's going on? Well, a couple of things. One is that the chains stumbled. I like that sound. It's okay. So the chains have stumbled. And the e-book market has saturated. And, imagine that. And the indies themselves have done a really good job of marketing, sort of reinventing themselves. But there's another thing that's happening, and you talk to the indie owners and managers, and they'll tell you that there's the consumers, or at least a significant subset of them, have sort of rediscovered something about the world of books. They've discovered that books are more than 20% discount and free delivery. That there is something, I know, go figure. They discovered that the bookstore itself is this sort of repository of something intangible and important and worth preserving. There's been this recognition that in the bookstore is something powerful, and it's hard to put on a bottom line. But it's where people can reconnect socially. It's where people can connect with ideas. They can discuss. It's where political movements can happen. It's where culture can be expressed and dissected and understood. It's where people can sort of re-engage socially and move beyond themselves and be happy to do it. And granted, it is a drop in the bucket. And I feel sort of all corny and patchouli-esque to be extolling this. But since it was such a downer, that was the story it was so depressing. It seems to me that it's a sign that things, who knows? Who knows? Maybe it's changing. It's a tiny step, but I think it's a step in the right direction, and it's the direction that we need to be focusing on, because it's the notion of pushing back, creating space, and insisting on a new, more human set of values. So I'm going to stop talking, and I would love to hear your questions and your suggestions and ideas, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Two things I would like to say. I grew up outside the United States, so I had a better chance of seeing the world, if you will. After the Second World War, the problems in the world were creating kind of benefit for the United States of America. America was actually benefiting from the troubles elsewhere in the world. Yeah. Today, the unwise American foreign policy is actually costing America quite a bit compared to what it's getting from the world. So the notion of we have done this before, I think you need to be a little careful about that, because the world has changed actually. That's one thing.
Good point.
I would like to hear your comment about that. The other thing is, I was born in Egypt, and looking at what happened in Egypt in the last 4 years can give us a real example of the danger of technology is allowing us to connect with. When people came out in Tahrir Square, they came together via the internet and Facebook and stuff like that. And it was very civilized, very nice picture in Tahrir Square, bringing the dictator down. But actually, they did not know what they wanted to replace it with. And then now they actually, whether we like it or not, they went back to a military kind of dictatorship again. So we have to be careful actually about technology is bringing us more in a social form and stuff like that, because I think now I know so many people, not as people. It's an email address or an email list and stuff like that. They are not really people, they are virtual people.
These are both really good points. I mean, let's look at the Arab Spring. I mean, you know, technology did allow people to sort of quickly and sort of quickly move to the streets and quickly move on political action. It did nothing for what was to come afterwards. And that feels a lot like a lot of the politics of today, unfortunately. I mean, there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of willingness to do something right away. But, you know, you talk to these activists, older activists, and of course they're going to be disappointed with anything that the next generation is doing. Just, you know, it's a given. But one of the things the guy said is, yeah, you know, these guys are like super enthusiastic, this older guy, he's sort of saying of the younger generation, they're super enthusiastic, they've got a lot of good ideas, they have so much energy, and they're skilled with these new forms of social media, but they don't have the endurance, they won't sit through a long meeting. You know, and he goes, look, politics is still a game of endurance. It's whoever can last the longest at the meeting is going to win. You know, because they're paying, the other side is paying people to sit at the meeting. And I think that's a good point. Forms of communication, I mean, we could spend a long time talking about the dangers that come in a society that's built on these electronic connections, and you've pointed to a few. So thank you very much for that. Great comment. Any others?
Yes, earlier you made a reference to basically maximizing shareholder value, very short-term gains, slashing R&D. How do you see the way back from this very short-term mindset to a much more long-term sustainable growth for corporations?
Okay, really good question. So it would be nice if corporations chose for themselves to sort of reorient their sort of profit model. But in the meantime, there's ways that we could sort of change the sort of tax environment to help them along the way. We could, for example, make it illegal once again to do share buybacks. I mean, up until the late 80s, it was illegal. We called it share price manipulation. So we sort of unfettered it because we felt it would be better for the efficient market. It's time to refetter it, I think. With the recognition that there are times when share buybacks make sense, but that's not what's happening today. There are ways to sort of give credits for R&D, to encourage more research, more long-term research. There's ways to penalize people who make quick capital gains versus long-term capital gains. And there's a whole system of rewarding companies with the notion of a prize. I mean, this is now beginning to be an economic model where you offer a substantial prize for the company that will, say, come up with a treatment for Ebola. You know, because otherwise you're looking at this fairly small market number of patients in a market that can't really afford to pay much in the way of medicine. So what company is going to tackle that under normal business circumstances? Well, you offer a prize you might be able to get. You might be able to sort of change that corporate strategy. So those are things we can do. But again, the impetus is going to need to come from below. And it's going to need to be something other than or in addition to a willingness to take to the streets. I mean, nothing against the Occupy movement. I mean, it sort of galvanized and gave us a new term, the 1%. But now we have to go, what's the next thing we do? There was another question.
Yes, so what do you say to the people who look at how we've outsourced our culture of instant gratification, in particular, for instance, the high net worth individuals in China or India or to some extent in Europe, but I think they've maintained more of their longer term thought culture than we have. So what do you say to the people who suggest that we can't go back because we have too much competition that will just walk over us essentially, right? If you have other countries that are indulging in self-interest and instant gratification, you lose out in the short term.
I'm afraid that's all the time we've got for questions tonight. No. So this is one of the killer questions. We sort of we can't go back to a time when we had a captive labor market, and we may have to recognize that at least part of what's going on is a global equalization, where we're sort of gutting our own middle class, but another middle class is arising in another country. I mean, I sort of hate that, but it's kind of what's happening. That being said, we do have to focus on local folks. And we have to recognize that if we don't do something to reverse, say, the vanishing middle class, it won't really matter what they're doing overseas, because we're going to have so much political instability that we won't have a ghost chance anyway. So we're going to need to ask ourselves some pretty tough questions, including this one. How are we going to measure success? How are we going to measure what real sustainable profit looks like? And that's really what it comes down to, because as long as it's simply the fastest, whoever gets to the bottom line the fastest, we're hosed. There's no turning back. The market will simply grind on its way, and it will turn up whatever it turns up, and we'll sort of be forced to be happy with that. If we decide instead that we are going to insist on a new way of sort of defining progress and profit, for example, if we decided to tax carbon. Now, I know, but the point is that has to be a global initiative. And it's not as if this isn't understood in China or anywhere else in the rest of the world. Everyone knows that it has to be a global initiative. And it's through those sorts of initiatives that I think we can begin the larger and more complicated and more difficult politically process of redefining wealth. Now, what I've just outlined is like, it'll never happen, right? I mean, how likely is that to happen? Okay, so fine, the probabilities are slim. But the alternative is worse, if you think about it. We really don't have a choice. We're going to have to redefine what we mean by success and what we mean by wealth. Because if we don't, we're going to end up being beaten by, if not China, our own destiny. We're going to basically eat our young. So it's a shitty deal versus a slightly less shitty deal, is what it comes down to. And maybe those are the options we've left ourselves. Well, too bad. Is that we don't get a do-over. There's no warranty on this. But yes, it's a global initiative.
I'd just like to make the point that education has a lot to do with this, because a lot of these problems just keep recurring throughout history. The 1920s, there were lots of things going on that were very similar to the 2000s, and people sort of go, oh, how could this ever happen? But it's happened before, and it keeps happening again. And I don't know, it's just a comment. If people were to take the lessons of the past, and if people were educated about the past, there'd probably be things would improve, I think. And I value your sort of thoughts on that regarding improving education. And certainly in the UK, there's a lot of talk about dumbing down of education, and that, children and young adults aren't really sort of taught the value of what history teaches us.
Wow, great last question. And seriously, so to unpack that, I mean, there's the issue of our education, our failure at sort of the education system. There is our failure at sort of reminding ourselves that history has a habit of repeating, and it has a lot to teach us. So I suppose there's a way of combining that by saying that, we have been here in many respects. The 1920s were very similar, and the response, the way that we responded then versus the way we responded here, is enlightening. We basically said, we basically stopped trusting the market, and we went probably too far the other way. But the point was, we decided that it was things like food and security were too important to leave to the market. We're it's so funny to hear us struggle with that today. It's as if it's different now. Well, I guess food and security, they're not quite important enough. We don't really need to worry about it. Maybe we'll leave them to the market. It's like we haven't quite decided. It's been what, 6 years, 7 years? So, and it's almost like we just hope it'll go away and we can go back to doing what we were doing. So yes, we need to sort of remember the things that we did. And and I guess the things we need to remember is not just the sort of the government initiatives and the heavy regulation, because it really bums a lot of people out, but the other things that we did, which were things like, it was human initiative. It was at the sort of the local level where people decided, they were forced, that they would come together, that they would put self-interest at least on a slightly different shelf level, and that they would pursue collective action, not necessarily because they suddenly loved their neighbors, but because they didn't see an alternative. And, maybe that's what needs to happen now. One hopes that the crisis isn't so far in the past now. It's 5 years that we've lost all the impetus. But that's really where it has to happen. And I think, the weird thing is, I used to be this unabashed liberal. I think a lot of people that sort of came of age in the 80s were. In part because I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the issues I was liberal on, right? It's just, oh, well, I hate Reagan, so therefore. And I'm still pretty liberal politically, but one of the things that I find myself becoming more, I guess, traditionally conservative about is just individual values, things like personal responsibility and patience and discipline and a willingness to look beyond yourself. These are things that, conservatives have traditionally fought for and worried about. And I think once we can sort of make the case that the market and market values, as important as the market is to moving this whole show along and as indispensable, I'm not suggesting we replace the market, but I am suggesting that we move market values out of our culture, or at least sort of reprioritize them, and recognize that those market values destroy the very values that many conservatives hold dear. Yeah. And once we recognize that and make that case, I think that you'll have a much wider spread support for a new way of valuing wealth. Call me a dreamer. But anyway, that's all the time we've got tonight. Thanks very much for coming out, and have a great season at Town Hall. Thanks very much.